February 23, 2023, in Quincy, Illinois, a 41-year-old woman was found dead inside her own home. The victim was Becky Bliefnick, a nurse well known in the community and the mother of 3 young sons. According to investigators, Becky was shot 14 times during an attack that took place in the early morning hours of that day. The case quickly shocked not only Quincy, but communities across the country. But what drew national attention wasn't just the brutality of the crime, it was the timing. Just days after Becky's death, a major hearing was scheduled in the nearly 2-year divorce case between Becky and her estranged husband. So what happened during the final months of that marriage? And how did a long and bitter divorce end in murder? Before her name appeared in headlines across America, Becky Bliefnick was known to those around her as a devoted mother and a dedicated nurse in Quincy, Illinois. Becky grew up in a close-knit family and excelled academically from an early age. After completing her education, she chose a career in healthcare and went on to work at Blessing Hospital, one of the largest medical centers in the region. Co-workers described Becky as calm, friendly, and always willing to help both patients and fellow staff members. Outside of work, much of Becky's time was devoted to her family, especially her 3 sons. According to relatives, her children were always the highest priority in her life. Whenever possible, Becky attended their school activities, sporting events, and the important milestones that mattered most to them. To many people in Quincy, Becky represented the image of a hardworking and responsible woman, doing her best to balance the demands of her career with the responsibilities of family life. Becky Bliefnick and Timothy Bliefnick were married in 2009. After getting married, the couple settled in Quincy, Illinois, where they began building a life together. Over the following years, they welcomed 3 sons and settled into a routine centered on work, family, and raising their children. According to public records, Becky worked in healthcare, while Tim pursued his own career. Like many families in the community, much of their time revolved around their children's activities and the demands of everyday family life. Family photographs from that period painted the picture of a stable household. Friends and acquaintances saw a couple raising 3 young boys and building a future together in Quincy. But behind that image, problems within Becky and Tim's marriage were beginning to emerge. Issues that were not easily visible to those on the outside. By the time the couple had been married for several years, their relationship was beginning to show signs of strain. According to testimony presented later in court, the disagreements went beyond the ordinary challenges of marriage. Issues involving parenting, household responsibilities, and plans for the future had become recurring sources of conflict. Witnesses later described a relationship that had grown increasingly tense over time. During the trial, prosecutors also referenced allegations of controlling behavior within the marriage. Those allegations were presented as part of the broader picture of the relationship before the couple separated. As the months passed, the conflict continued to grow, and what had once appeared to be a stable marriage was becoming increasingly divided. By 2021, the problems in the marriage between Becky Bliefnick and Timothy Bliefnick had reached a point where they could no longer be resolved through conversations or attempts at reconciliation. In January 2021, Tim filed for divorce. After more than a decade together, their marriage officially entered the legal process of coming to an end. But the divorce did not move quickly. According to court records, the case stretched on for nearly 2 years, with both sides unable to reach agreement on several key issues. Among the most significant was the care and custody of their 3 sons. Throughout that period, Becky and Tim lived separately. Arrangements involving parenting time, visitation schedules, and parental responsibilities remained ongoing points of dispute. As the legal battle continued, the tension between them appeared to grow. The conflict extended beyond child custody. Financial matters and disagreements about life after divorce also became recurring sources of friction. According to testimony presented later at trial, Becky often confided in friends and family about the pressure she was experiencing during this period. Several witnesses said she frequently expressed concern about the direction of the divorce proceedings and the increasingly strained relationship between her and Tim. During the divorce, both Becky and Tim sought legal protections at different times. Court records show that Becky filed for an emergency order of protection. Tim also pursued similar legal measures. Ultimately, none of those requests resulted in a long-term protective order. As the divorce case continued into its second year, Becky's concerns appeared to intensify. One of the most discussed pieces of evidence presented at trial was a series of text messages she sent to people close to her. In one message to her sister, Sarah Riley, Becky wrote that if anything ever happened to her, the first person people should look at was Tim. Prosecutors later argued that the messages reflected the level of concern Becky was experiencing during the final stages of the divorce. The defense, however, challenged that interpretation, arguing that portions of the messages were being viewed without their full context. Regardless of how they were interpreted, those messages became an important part of the case. By early 2023, the divorce was still unresolved. A significant court hearing had been scheduled for late February. It was expected to address several of the issues that remained in dispute between the two sides. That hearing, however, would never take place. Just days before it was set to begin, events in Quincy would transform a nearly 2-year divorce case into a murder investigation.
On the 22nd of February, 2023, Becky Bliefnick spent most of the day at her home on Kentucky Road in Quincy, Illinois. At the time, she was recovering from a recent surgery. According to evidence presented at trial, Becky's 3 sons were not with her that night. They were staying elsewhere under a previously arranged parenting schedule. Throughout February 22, there were no reports of anything unusual. Her final communications appeared to be part of her normal daily routine. Then, during the early morning hours of February 23, Becky's phone registered a call to Navicentaudici. According to court records, the call was never completed and no conversation was recorded between the caller and the emergency dispatcher. However, investigators later determined that the call occurred at roughly the same time. They believe the attack took place. It would become the final known signal from Becky before all communication with her suddenly stopped.
According to investigators, the attack took place during the early morning hours of February 23, 2023, at Becky Bliefnick's home on Kentucky Road in Quincy, Illinois. Investigators determined that the intruder entered the residence through a second-floor window. Evidence collected at the scene indicated that the window had been forced open before the attack. Once inside, the intruder moved through the home and made contact with Becky. Evidence recovered during the investigation, along with testimony presented at trial, suggested that Becky attempted to defend herself during her final moments. According to the forensic findings, Becky was shot multiple times during the attack. The autopsy later concluded that she died from gunshot wounds. What happened inside that home during the early morning hours of February 23rd brought an end to the life of a mother of 3, just days before a major hearing in her long-running divorce case was scheduled to take place. On the morning of February 23, 2023, Becky Bliefnick failed to appear where she was expected to be and did not respond to calls or messages from family members. The silence was unusual and quickly raised concern. According to court records, Becky's father, William Postle, went to the home on Kentucky Road to check on her. When he entered the residence, he found his daughter unresponsive and immediately called 911 for emergency assistance. Within a short time, officers from the Quincy Police Department and emergency responders arrived at the scene. After an initial assessment, medical personnel pronounced Becky dead. The area surrounding the home was quickly secured as investigators began processing the scene. What may have first appeared to be an unexplained death was soon being treated as a homicide investigation. But it was the evidence found inside the house that would begin to reveal what had happened during the night before. Investigators recovered spent shell casings, footwear impressions, and other items of evidence for forensic examination. They also located what was believed to be Becky's cell phone near the area where the attack occurred. In the days that followed, the investigation expanded beyond the crime scene. Detectives reviewed surveillance footage from nearby homes, businesses, and public areas throughout the neighborhood. The footage revealed a person riding a bicycle near Becky's home, around the time the crime was believed to have occurred. That image quickly became one of the most important leads in the investigation. As detectives traced the bicycle, they discovered it had been purchased through a Facebook account using the name John Smith. Further investigation allegedly linked that account to Timothy Bliefnick. At the same time, search warrants were executed for electronic devices associated with Tim. According to evidence presented at trial, investigators discovered a number of searches that drew their attention, including queries related to pry tools, homemade suppressors, and methods for removing gunshot residue. Beyond the digital evidence, detectives also examined information related to the couple's long-running divorce. Text messages, along with statements from friends and family, indicated that Becky had expressed concerns about the relationship during the final stages of the marriage. As investigators began putting the pieces together, the surveillance footage, the bicycle, the Facebook account, the electronic evidence, and witness testimony, their focus gradually narrowed to one person. By that point, the investigation was increasingly centered on Timothy Bliefnick. After nearly 3 weeks of investigation, detectives believed they had gathered enough evidence to take the next step. On March 13, 2023, Timothy "Tim" Bliefnick was arrested by law enforcement in Quincy, Illinois. Authorities reported no significant resistance during the arrest. That same day, the Adams County State's Attorney's Office announced formal charges against Tim. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of home invasion. According to prosecutors, Tim had planned and carried out the attack that led to the death of Becky Bliefnick during the early morning hours of February 23, 2023. With the charges now formally filed, the case moved from the investigative phase into the criminal court process. But the question of guilt or innocence would ultimately be decided in a courtroom, and that process was only beginning. Timothy "Tim" Bliefnick's trial began in May 2023 in Adams County, Illinois. From the outset, prosecutors argued that the killing was not a spontaneous act, but the result of a plan that had been developed in advance. Throughout the trial, the prosecution presented evidence, they said, connected Timothy Bliefnick to the crime and demonstrated premeditation. In addition to the digital evidence, jurors heard testimony from numerous witnesses, including friends, family members, and investigators who worked the case. Some of that testimony focused on the increasingly contentious divorce between Becky and Tim in the years leading up to the murder. The defense, however, rejected the allegation that Tim was responsible for Becky's death. Defense attorneys argued that portions of the prosecution's case relied on inference rather than direct proof, and did not conclusively place their client at the scene when the crime occurred. They also challenged certain testimony presented to the jury. Over the course of the trial, dozens of witnesses were called to testify, and nearly 200 exhibits were introduced into evidence. After days of testimony and arguments from both sides, the jury began reviewing the case and weighing the evidence before reaching a final verdict. At that point, Timothy Bliefnick's future rested in the hands of the jury. On May 31, 2023, after completing deliberations, the jury in Adams County, Illinois, reached a verdict in the case against Timothy "Tim" Bliefnick. Jurors found Tim guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of home invasion in connection with the death of Becky Bliefnick. A few months later, on August 11, 2023, Judge Robert Adrian sentenced Tim to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During sentencing, the court concluded that the evidence presented had established that the defendant planned and carried out the murder. Tim later appealed his conviction. However, an Illinois appellate court ultimately upheld both the guilty verdict and the sentence. Legally, the case had come to an end. But for Becky's family, the impact of what happened would continue long after the courtroom proceedings were over. After the trial ended and the appeals process gradually came to a close, the people left to live with the consequences were not the attorneys or the investigators. They were Becky Bliefnick's family. At the center of that loss were Becky's 3 sons. In a short period of time, they lost their mother and watched their father receive a life sentence for crimes connected to her death. It was a reality that no verdict could ever undo. Alongside Becky's children were her parents, her sister, and the family members who had shared her life for decades. In statements presented to the court, Relatives spoke repeatedly about the void Becky left behind, not only as a daughter or a sister, but as a mother whose children were always her highest priority. And it is those losses, more than any courtroom ruling, that continue to define the lasting impact of this case. Because beyond the investigation, the trial, and the verdict, a family was left to move forward without someone they loved. The Becky Bliefnick case demonstrates that not every marriage comes to an end when a couple separates or files for divorce. In some cases, long-standing conflicts can continue to escalate, leading to consequences that no one anticipated. During the trial, jurors heard testimony about the ongoing tensions between Becky and Tim throughout the final stages of their marriage. Evidence presented in court included allegations of controlling behavior, unresolved conflict, and concerns that became increasingly significant as the divorce process continued. While every relationship is different, the case serves as a reminder that warning signs within a deteriorating relationship should not be ignored. Seeking support from family, friends, or appropriate resources can play an important role when conflicts begin to intensify. In the end, the greatest consequence was not the life sentence handed down in court. It was the loss left behind. A mother was gone. 3 children were left to grow up without her. And a family was forced to continue forward, carrying a loss that no verdict could ever fully repair.